Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Emily, and I'll be the host for today's Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Noble Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors here locally in Washington, D.C., and in 35 countries around the globe. The Hinckley Institute also offers classes, the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences to Washington, D.C., and over $70,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to go next door or to our website, www.hinckley.utah.edu, for more information. The title of today's forum is Positive Youth Development, Community Resistance to Institutionalized Racial Profiling. I would now like to welcome Ed Munoz, Director of Ethnic Studies and the co-chair for the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee.
Thank you, Emily, and once again, thanks to everybody that's here today, taking some time out of your busy days. And I want to kind of try to keep everything going right along, and so I'm just going to introduce our moderator for today. Our moderator is Jennifer Napier-Pierce. She's currently a multimedia reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune. In the past, she has worked for both KUER and KCPW, receiving numerous awards for her work. She regularly moderates community events and has been an adjunct professor at the University of Utah. She is an alum of the U and received her master's degree from Stanford University. And we'd like to have the panelists give a few remarks to some questions we have first, and then we'll have a Q&A after about 50 minutes or so. Okay? Thank you. Jennifer.
It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and also a pleasure for me to introduce our distinguished panelists. Although it just walked away. Ed, my descriptions. I'll start with Chief Burbank. Chief Chris Burbank has been with the Salt Lake City Police Department since 1991. He was appointed to the position of Chief of Police in 2006, and he became the 45th chief last January as one of 6 police chiefs in the nation to meet with President Barack Obama to discuss the administration's plan and direction. Consoled to have you, Chief. Thank you so much for joining us. Also with us on the far left, I suppose, is Dr. Teresa Martinez. She's currently Associate Professor of Sociology and former Assistant Vice President for Academic Outreach at the University of Utah, and her teaching and research deals with issues of race, class, and gender, deviant behavior, juvenile delinquency, and pop culture. And great to have you here, Dr. Martinez. Thanks. Also with us, Debbie Rocha. She graduated from the University of Utah with her master's degree in social work in 1998. She's been with the Division of Juvenile Justice Services for the past 30 years in many capacities, including counselor, case manager, supervisor, and most recently, assistant program director. She's also been through the continuum of care from working in a secure setting to community-based and now early intervention services. And she currently works part-time with the Salt Lake City School District as an elementary counselor. Debbie, great to have you. And finally, Dr. Brenda Valles. She works as the Director of Research and Assessment for the Office for Equity and Diversity here at the university. Her research looks at the educational pipeline for underrepresented students, particularly Latino students, and her doctoral degree is in educational leadership and policy, and her research tool to prison pipeline. Dr. Valles, welcome to you. I want to start with the general question, just sort of to set the stage. What is racial profiling? Let's get your perspective. Dr. Martinez, let's start with you.
There's lots of different ways to define racial profiling, but as I understand it as a sociologist, when you have FBI doing criminal profiling, what they do is they look at criminal behaviors in order to identify certain kinds of perpetrators, like rapists or serial killers, etc. What racial profiling does is it centralizes all focus on the race of an individual as opposed to their behavior. So if you're looking for a person who is driving while black or driving while brown, all you have to do is see the race of the individual. Many studies have been done on racial profiling that proved that it occurs quite rampantly in the United States. And for example, studies have been done in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles. Studies have even been done here in the state of Utah. And I'm going to talk about undocumented immigrants as part of understanding this process. One of the things that the Arizona immigration bill and the Alabama immigration bill right out of the closet as to what it really is, which is let's stop someone because they're racial, a reality in terms of our understanding. I think that if you really look at that kind of legislation, which was almost passed here in Utah, we can see that it's really not focused on criminal behavior. It's focused on who is a person, where's a person from, and what do they look like, basically, which of course is racial profiling. It is the key to racial profiling. So I guess the take home from this, and I'm in my teacher mode, is the difference between profiling a behavior and profiling a person's race. And that's how I see the difference between them.
Chief Burbank.
Well, I think Teresa's absolutely right. The important thing is profiling is good police practice, right? And that's profiling for behavior. And the laws are set up that when you can observe behavior and you can describe it and say, this is why I believe somebody is engaged in criminal activity, then that's okay for the police to interject themselves into that. And that's basically the standard that we have set forth. But what we have done and what you've seen in practice is the fact that people use what someone looks like in order to start establishing that. And they say, whatever it may be, are more likely to engage in criminal activity. Thus, we have to interject ourselves, be a potential threat to the United States, right? It's a Middle Eastern gentleman in his 20s with a beard, a turban. Now, if you were going to take it to the extreme and say, in fact, those types of individuals are the ones that are the largest threat to our nation, and you were the terrorist or the potential terrorist, would you dress the part and risk the chance of being stopped because you look just like what the description may be? Absolutely not. And so what we lose sight of is the behavior that may be taking place because all we see is the race, the skin color, or what someone looks like. And it is a very poor practice, and it leads to shoddy police work because it's police work that you cannot demonstrate when it goes to court and proceeds through the system. Where behavior-based, right? I saw this through my training and experience. Someone was doing this with their hand. It appeared to be narcotics in their hand. And from my experience, it's wrapped in small packages, balloons. There was a hand-to-hand. Started interjecting race. We lose sight of that behavior. And that is really, again, what law is based on in this country. Time and time again, I'm saying racial profiling. And I'm not here to tell you racial profiling is good. It is absolutely bad. But we have said, all right, so many of our people in our society are white, so many people are black, so many people are Latino or Hispanic. And if the number of police stops is representative of the number of people in that community, then we're okay with that and we move on. And this benchmarking is just a poor measurement as to what is more subtle, and what I prefer, as opposed to just looking at racial profiling, is what is bias policing. Right? What is the bias that we interject into the system? And it becomes much more subtle. It's not just about who you stop. How often do you search somebody? How often do you write them a citation? What are the hit ratios, right? If you are searching somebody, are you successful in that search? And those are the things that you start to look at that is really the subtle racism that takes place in society that we need to be more concerned about. Right, that we need to pay attention to. As an administrator in a police department, I can interject bias into my officers with not any intention whatsoever. If I send my officers out and say, I want you to write everybody who has expired registration, right? It's a big problem, we need to do something about it. Well, is that going to impact, it's going to become more of a socioeconomic thing than it is about registration, because people who have less understanding of the language, people who have less money are going to be less inclined to have that. And so who are those individuals? They're going to be individuals of color that we are going to stop at a much higher rate when all I'm looking at, right, is what the tag says on the license plate. But that interjects bias into the system. And so we constantly have to be aware of what is that underlying bias. And you can imagine when Mrs. Jones, right, most of what we know is from TV, when she looks out the window and she sees 4 teenage individuals of color wearing sports memorabilia, standing on the street corner at 10 o'clock at night. She dials up the police and says, what does she see? She sees gang members, right? And of course they have guns, knives, and whatever else. And of course they're dealing drugs. Now, I wouldn't have my job very long if we said, well, Mrs. Jones, I'm sure they're just nice people. Don't worry about them. We'll see you later, and hang up on her. Right? So, no, we have to send a response. Well, if in fact they are gang members, if they are dealing drugs, we don't just send one police officer, we send 2 police officers. So we're already interjecting bias into the system before we ever bring in what may be the potential bias that exists in a police officer. Right? We're already putting that in the system. So we ask a great deal of our officers to discern when they get there. All right, is this a situation that they need to be involved in? And again, as you know from TV, I mean, it's a dangerous situation. So we don't walk up and shake hands. How are you tonight? Right? We stand off and we posture and everything. And it becomes a very biased and poor practice right from the beginning that if we have a better understanding, right, if we have more communication that takes place, then we can somehow put an end to some of the bias that's interjected into the system.
Dr. Valles, your thoughts?
I agree with both Dr. Martinez and Chief Burbank, and what I would add to that is that understanding how the bias is developed, we have to know and recognize that we have a set of cultural norms that we have developed, and these are national, and we have a very unique set of cultural norms in Utah, and these are based on some of the dominant ideologies of our state. So what that means is anywhere where you deviate from that cultural norm, you're already going to be perceived as different, which is what gets to some of the bias. Where does that bias come from? It comes from certain values attributed to characteristics, to either phenotype, to how you dress, to how you speak, if you have an accent, if you are not from this particular country, or the assumption that there's assumptions and value tied to characteristics. And the farther those characteristics go from what our norm is in our state and in our communities, and since this is a national issue, to our country, we're able to see that's sort of where it may be coming from. In my work in looking at the Utah school to prison pipeline, I found that this was the case in schools, and I know you'll be able to speak more to this, but if a student, dressed a particular way, if a student looked a particular way, these assumptions and this bias was born, and it was sort of placed on these students, whether or not they had that characteristic, whether or not they were gang members, they would be targeted. And I think that's where racial profiling happens, because these characteristics may tend to be shared by a particular racial ethnic demographic because we are not the norm. This particular group may not be the norm. So I also think we were able to see that it exists. I know it came up in the conversation with Trayvon's mother when she came and spoke. And she talked about how it could be other groups and how we can all be affected by it at some point. When I was looking at what it is in terms of the school to prison pipeline, I found that the disproportional rates of punishment for students within the disciplinary umbrella was so much higher for students, Chicano and Latino students, males, than they were for their white counterparts, that it became really evident. She talked about, Trayvon's mother spoke of the need to look at statistics, and we have those statistics. So we're able to identify those patterns of racial profiling, and we're able to identify how it's problematic, where we see it, but we also need to be able to say, well, where do we go from there?
Debbie Rocha.
Well, I totally agree with everything that's been said here in regards to that we are supposed to be looking at the behavior, and I think that even kids that were not in trouble, that they, that was part of the thing that they'd get pulled over because they were assumed that they were part of a gang or that they were not, where they were supposed to be and things like that. And so I think that it's important that we do look at the behavior. An example of racial profiling just happened to one of my staff, a 42-year-old man, and he looks like in his mid-30s, and it just happened 3 months ago. And he was out doing a home visit he's a home detention counselor. He was out going to check on one of the kids that we have on home detention. And it was in the Fashion Place neighborhood district area. And he didn't know, he hadn't been to that home before, and so he was looking for the address, so he kind of had to do a little, checking and stuff. Then he pulled in, he pulled into office space where there's dentist offices where there was only parking because he couldn't park where the house was and stuff. There was no area. He gets out of the car. He's in a state vehicle. It's not marked anywhere in regards to the panels or anything like that, because we're all supposed to be discreet when we go out and do home visits on these kids in terms of not letting the neighborhood know that they're on home detention. But there has the EX on the plates. He gets out of the car. The the officers approach him, and he says, "Can I help you?" And they says, "Well." He goes, he gives him his badge, gives him his license, and he's Hispanic, and like I said, he looks in his mid-30s, and they said, well, we're just, check in and stuff, and so then he goes, well, I'm here to, see a kid and stuff, and so they take his license, they go back to the car, they check him out, after he shows his IDs and everything, and then they come back, and then they're kind of just then they get on the phone, and so he's kind of worrying that they're calling me because he gives them his card and thinks, oh, they're going to call my boss, and and so he calls me after then they left him, and then he goes to the house across the street, goes to the house, just check on the kid, comes back, and they're still there waiting, just waiting until he leaves, and it's just that kind of thing that really upset him. He, when he got back to the office, he was and it was like towards the evening part, around 6:30, and it was just as the time changes so it was starting to get a little darker earlier than later, and so he comes back to the office, and and I happen to be there, and he's all shaken up and saying, this is what happened to me, and he played it off with humor, but you could tell he was very upset and angry that he was being profiled.
You're each coming at this issue from different places. How bad is it here in Utah? Give us a sense of the nature and the scope. Let's start, Debbie.
Well, I think it's better than it was before, and I think a lot of it has to be, at least for the Salt Lake Police Department, I think it's better since Chief Burbank has been on board. I think it has been a lot better in regards to how their officers are being trained. I have sat on many committees that we've discussed these issues, and I think they've been very open to looking at the issue and making it better. But doesn't mean that it's not still existing. But it's been a lot better. I think before, like in the early 90s, 80s, it was bad. It was really bad because we had a task force that was established in 1999, and there was a lot of town meetings that were held, and a lot of the issues was the racial profiling, that the law enforcement were racially profiling.
Dr. Martinez, I've cut you off. I apologize.
No, completely right about this. It's something that has been terrible, and now it's just bad. It still happens all the time. And I want to point out something that one of my colleagues here, Dr. William Smith, in Education, Culture, and Society Studies and all this, who would say that this also leads to, imagine that man's experience, and imagine the blood pressure that's happening there, and what it does to the human body, and what it does to a person. And what he'll find is that this is actually going to lead to illnesses, and why black men. My students, how would you feel if you were stopped once a month? How would you feel if you were stopped once every 2 months? I mean, when does it start to get, and by the way, my students would be like really pissed off once in a year, twice in a year. Imagine it being continuous and often. So I'll ask my African American students or my Pacific Islander students or my American Indian students, by the way, Middle Eastern students, dear Lord. I mean, when we, that's actually still off the hook in terms of really, really bad. When we do polls of my own students, and they're freshmen, some of them, they're like, 18, 19 years old, some of them 17, and you ask them, which is the group that you don't want to be in your country, in your neighborhood? It's Middle Eastern people. Not just blacks and Latinos, not just me, and it's Middle Eastern people have the worst rates in terms of how people judge them. And that's a post 9/11 phenomenon. But I guess what I'm saying is I look at this issue and I see it creating huge issues for individuals, for families, and for community. And yes, it's gotten better because of wonderful leaders like Chief Burbank and others, but it's still a markedly important, difficult issue that we have not seen, go away. And I also have to say about police officers, they're only as good as we are. Mm-hmm. So if, people judge police officers, and I've done police trainings, Chris knows, that's how I met Chris Burbank, but it's like police officers are as good as the public. So if they're showing racism, they're showing our racism in our communities.
Chief Burbank, you hear a story like Debbie's friend. Yeah. Good policing, racial profiling. Well, there's a line there. And as an officer on the beat, how do you navigate it?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of directions that you need to look at, because one of the things, one, you have to say, yes, it happens. Because Teresa's absolutely right. We're a microcosm of society. We hire from society, right? I don't get to pick police officers out of something. So they bring with them their bias. They bring with them the family prejudices and everything else that they've grown up with. And what we try and do is say, all right, what can you bring to the department, and what do we want you to leave behind? And we want life experience. You don't want somebody who's grown up in a vacuum. You want people who have life experience, who understand and who have participated. And so they come in and they bring with them some of that, and then they need to set it aside. So what we have to do as an administrator is to say, all right, it does exist, right? It's not going to exist in my police department. I'm going to do everything I can, and it starts at the top, who you interact with, how you interact, right? The message that you send to your people all the time. When someone calls and complains, you follow through and you investigate that. Now, it's always interesting because I get the call. I was stopped only because of my skin color, only because I was old, because whatever the reason may be. And you say, all right, explain the circumstances. And you look. Well, modern radar, right, picks up a car at about 300-400 yards each. Driver in the car at that distance if you're running radar. And so you start to pick that up. And so what you have to look at is, again, those subtle things that come, right? But what was missing from the encounter that was described here is the interaction and the understanding that should take place between the officers and the people they're talking to. Hi, who are you today? Right? Having a conversation, that's good police work, right? Maybe that is suspicious activity. Maybe he was pulling in and out. Maybe somebody called, police officer pulls over. But there's a way to solve that and have a conversation and send that person away feeling like that you actually cared about who they are and what they were doing, as opposed to, hey, I'm just trying to fill out a ticket or a quota mark. And so a lot of it has to do with the personal interaction that takes place. And I think that's the message that, again, needs to be sent time and time again. We've shown in this country over and over again, racial profiling, bias policing exists. Well, now what are we going to do about it, right? What are we going to do to make that change?
Dr. Valles, you mentioned that you study patterns of racial profiling. What do you see here in Utah?
I looked at it within the school-to-prison pipeline, and I looked at 2 school districts in the state, and I contrasted Chicano Latinos males with their white counterparts to see what the differences were. And I found really pretty stark differences. For instance, they're punished at a 3 times higher rate, Chicano Latinos are, than their white counterparts. And they're punished in a much harsher way than their white counterparts are. So
instead of going to school to
expelled, or they're more likely to be accused of having a weapon for an object. And early time, it happens between 3rd and 6th grade at the highest. So, for instance, there is this session and we're discussing it. I would respectfully disagree that it's better, either in our state or in our country, because the prison system is continually growing with the population, and the population is African American and Latino. So I don't know that we're necessarily getting better as a country with this or as a state. I know that part of it may have to do, and some of the argument is that our demographics are shifting in our state. We are now a larger Latino population. We're considered, like in the literature, a new Latino immigrant state. So yes, it's good we're having these efforts, but I don't know, based on my research and the demographics largely around the prison growth, that we're necessarily doing better.
Chief Burbank, you're our only municipal representative here, so I guess I'm going to have to shift the burden to you to represent all law enforcement. It's completely unfair, I realize, but I mean, you've been around long enough to see communities responding. What are some specific ways that community police departments are responding to racial profiling? Obviously, you're doing training in-house, but I mean, what else? What else are you seeing?
Well, so training is the beginning. I mean, you obviously have to educate your officers. You have to educate the command staff, right? This is what we're doing. This is the bias that you can interject into it. But also, I think the thing that's important is when you look, we have incarcerated people in this country at a higher rate than any other nation in the world. Of anywhere. We still have more crime changed because of this. And so when we look at our prison population, when you look, studies have been shown that, you know, people of color, gender, they don't commit crime at a higher rate than any other ethnic group or any, you know, Caucasian group. And so what you get, why then, right, do we insist on constantly doing this? And so the solution is, right, not incarceration, The solution is in alternatives to incarceration. And that, again, is where we are better. Because what we start to do is we identify and we have a one-on-one conversation. What is best for this individual? And it's not always incarceration. It's not, detention in school. And I've always thought it's silly if somebody's having a hard time in school that we'd want to suspend them from going to school. Isn't it better to have them
More school, right?
And so, but that's the same sort of thing that we get when you start talking about incarceration, because what you look at, especially individuals of color, are incarcerated at a much higher rate for lesser crimes. Right? We're not talking homicides. We're talking lesser crimes that they are spending more time in the prison system or in the jail system than white people. And so, are we solving the problem? And obviously, we're not. And so, it takes a shift in saying, okay, this is how we're going to do business. We're going to change how we interact and how the criminal justice system as a whole works. And we've not yet gotten there.
Dr. Martinez?
I was going to say, we can say that you could say this, there are pockets of improvement, obviously. We have, my personal opinion and professional opinion, one of the best police chiefs in the country who really cares about these issues and who really cares and stands up. Believe me, this kind of a forum couldn't have happened with practically any other police chief in Salt Lake City going back. And I've been here 23 years. And if it had been those police chiefs, this conversation couldn't even be held here or even discussed. When I moved here, the faculty in my department would say things up front, like straight up to their students. We're talking sociology faculty who are no longer here, who are retired or gone, who would say, oh, hey, what was it? Shackling slaves worked really well. We should do that with juveniles. Or how about this one? Pacific Islanders, they're inherently violent. We need to, by professors here at the university. So yeah, we've had some growth. Now, wow, what Brenda's bringing up here, Dr. Baez is bringing up here is about the school-to-prison pipeline, though, and our prisons. And wow, that has been an immovable object. Racist practices and institutional racism and how it leads into the prison pipeline, that has not even been hardly touched. So you see what I mean by pockets. You've got wonderful police chiefs, or you have great leadership, maybe mayors or et cetera, right? But then you still have some statutes and laws that are unfair. You still have practices. And it's not just law enforcement. There's other things going on in the school-to-prison pipeline, including counselors and teachers and administrators in schools. So all these things add up, and there's still huge issues. I was going to say prisons alone. I mean, that's one of the worst discussions about race in prison are some of the worst, most harsh. I mean, the death penalty is meted out by race. I mean, that's a racist practice in the schools, in the prison system.
Chief Burbank,
just one quick comment, because it's interesting. When I look back on my life, when I was a student at the University of Utah, if a politician or someone had stood up and said that all black males are more violent and thus should be incarcerated because of this, right? They would not be in office very long, and there would have been huge outcry. We have politicians now who say Latinos are more apt to commit crimes and thus ought to be deported, jailed, or detained, and they get applause and reelected time and time again.
Yes.
And so where does that issue lie? I mean, the politician, I got certainly problems with that, but the public that reelects them time and time again is responsible for that, and we need to do a better job.
Debbie, can you talk about the school, how schools are responding? Because obviously, from Dr. Valle's research, it starts early.
It does start early, and unfortunately, I think one of the good things that, at least for the Salt Lake School District, and that's where a lot of our population is in regards to minorities, but I think with the school districts, they have instituted where they now have counselors in the elementary schools, where the other districts do not. And that's been a big support and help, because the kids are starting at a younger age in regards to, being discriminated or not being treated fairly. And I think that the other issue, again, has to be then, too, that counselors reflect the population that that is being served.
Correct.
And that's not happening. And so there's that point in regards to that piece. And I agree with Chief Burbank in regards to the fact that politicians, I mean, we know that incarceration does not make difference in our young kids. It is the early intervention services. And without funds, though, how do we deal with that? How do we, without the resources, how do we help that make that happen?
I want to just throw this statistic out there. I think it was from a New York Times story that I read this morning. By age 18, this is all Americans, 30% of black men, 30% of black men have been arrested by age 18. 26% of Hispanics and 22% of white men. These are all male populations, but if you think about that in the big picture, that's a lot of incarcerations before you graduate from high school. I wanted to open it up to some questions from you. We are recording this for radio, so you'll need to come up and state your name and your question into a microphone. While you're collecting your thoughts, I want to throw this at you. Last week, the White House, actually the Department of Justice, said it's changing its policy. It's going to prohibit federal agents from considering religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation in their investigations. Is this policy change going to help when it comes to racial profiling? Any thoughts there?
That's good. Brenda, you were responding to it.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of some of the policies I saw to sort of speak to that indirectly. There's some schools that operate with zero tolerance, and there's some schools that don't. Zero tolerance is the larger expulsion, harsher punishment, and the reason I'm comparing that with this is because some of the schools one of the schools I looked at had it, one didn't. And the one that did not operate with zero tolerance said, we don't use it because we don't want to create these disproportional outcomes. But the result was the same. Because oftentimes it doesn't matter what the policy is, it's about the interpretation and the practice, and how the folks who are interpreting and how they understand what they're supposed to do is much more important, and gets back to some of what you both discussed in terms of bias and what you're looking for than the actual policy itself. We all of a sudden have teachers that become, within the schools, that become policy makers and changers based on how they apply these. So I would, in my opinion, based on my work, I would say I would be hesitant to say it'll make a significant difference, because a lot of that goes back to the perception.
So she's trying to say something. It's like civil rights, right? Civil rights should have happened in 1964, but of course it got rolled back and changed. Depends on how it's actually used, if anybody actually listens to it or pays attention to it. So the policy sounds good, but will it become an actual practice is, I think, what Dr. Bias is saying.
And civil libertarians are curious what that means if you isolate it only to investigations or to surveillance as well.
Oh, right.
Chief Burbank, any thoughts?
Well, it's a step in the right direction. I think the thing that's important is when you look, how are you going to make institutional change? How are you going to change the practice? We need to start taking those steps, and having someone come out and say, okay, the Department of Justice is going to behave this way, the Salt Lake City Police Department is going to behave this way, are steps in the right direction. One of the things that I'm working very hard with a group of police chiefs from across the country is to establish standards by which we judge whether or not we are profiling or interjecting bias into the system. So that across the country, just like you can open up the FBI book and say this is how many homicides occurred in Salt Lake City, New York, or anywhere else, you can look and say this is how many, or this is the measurement in which we determine bias. And so it becomes a national standard as opposed to a piecemeal sort of thing across the country. So I always say we're going to start changing our practice, but now let's start measuring that and determining, right? Yeah. Did we, in fact, impact that practice? Have we changed our behavior?
I'd love to get your thoughts and questions if there's anyone in the audience who wants to chime in. Seriously? Okay, right here.
Good afternoon. I appreciate this conversation. It's a very timely and important topic. So my question is there is a rise in for-profit prisons. Right. So can you all speak to perhaps the relationship of men of color in prisons, or even a school to prison pipeline, and that relationship to for-profit prisons? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Who wants to take it? Dr. Valles?
That's a really good question, Dr. Johnson. And I want to say it goes back to the economic appeal, because folks have found that there's an equation that's working. There is a really huge growth, and there continues to be a growth. It's really steady of incarcerating black and brown men, and the incarceration, the prison industrial system. So there's so much profit that humans that are within the system are now viewed as capital. And so I think it is really economically based, and it's really unfortunate because it dehumanizes an entire population of people that it's incarcerating.
And
Dr. Martinez?
Dr. Johnson, I was going to say, this is something that comes up in hip-hop music quite a great deal, this prison industrial complex. And even with popular hip-hop artists, not just like underground hip-hop artists. So it's, I mean, Dr. Baez is right on. It's all about making money. In the past, right, there were African slaves, right? And then there was the prisoner lease system in the 19th century, where if a black man was vagrant, they'd pick him up and lease him to a plantation. So he was still a slave. And now there's the prison industry complex, which basically means that black men just go to prison and then they become somebody who makes money for another capitalist order. So it's a horrifying proposition all the way around. Angela Davis has great research on this, as you know.
Was there a question over here?
In the back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I just kind of find it like really difficult to even ask a question because it's just right in our eyes. We don't have to be anywhere to look at racial profiling in Utah. Obviously, it's on both sides of the state police and the educational system. But what is really going to be done about it? Because it's just seems like it's just a story that we shouldn't even be talking about. It's already there, but what's going to happen? You know, I'm just happy to hear that we said American Indian at least once in the conversation, let alone being like the lowest populated on campus, and 9 times of our children are in foster and juvenile care, and 2/3 of them end up in prison. So, like with that, like I really don't know what to say at all. So, like, what are we going to do about it?
You said quite a bit just by saying that. I was going to say, to your point, interestingly, you and I, right, and maybe a lot of people in this room understand this issue, or at least know what's going on, but a lot of people don't even think it exists. Is that not sad? So we're here on a university campus trying to talk about something that we all see all the time, and some of you are like, really? Really, does that happen? Most of my students don't have a clue that this happens. And not only that, but they're like, really? They look at the statistics and they say, really? Does it really happen? So do you know a lot of my work is trying to convince people of things that I see as very obvious. So, but I wanted to ask Chris about this, but I think that we have some leadership in this community that I can actually turn to with respect and say they're really doing things. For example, the Inclusion Center for Community and Justice, we've got the executive director and staff right here, and Chief Chris Burbank, faculty on campus, Dr. Karen Johnson, Dr. Ed Munoz, Dr. Brenda Baez, Dr. Fileti Matani. There are people in this, Dr. Edwin Napier, there are people in this audience that are working their whole lives on issues like this, either to raise awareness, to make positive change, to get their students to become, I hope, lawyers, social workers, other things. So I'm not throwing in the towel, and I've been teaching here a long time, but even if I have to tell those little 17 and 18-year-olds that it's happening, I'm okay to do that and then take it the next step.
Debbie Rocha, what do you see as a way out?
Well, I hope I'm making an impact, and I think it's us as individuals that are going to make it happen. And being in the school system now with elementary kids, I give them hope, and I hope that I help them to rise above all the things that are going on in their lives, because there's a lot of things that they're dealing with, and so I think in this room that's willing to step up and support each other.
Dr. Valles, you're skeptical when it comes to policy. What about legislation?
I would use those terms interchangeably.
Okay, all right.
I'm going to go back to him.
So what's going to work then?
But that goes back to Dr. Martinez's point. That's why we do this work, to raise awareness, to talk to legislators. Yes. Through my work, I was legislators, superintendents. If I'm able to have that conversation, because to me this is personal. This is not just research because it's interesting or because it's timely. This is personal. So to address what you said, I feel what you're saying, and that's why I do what I do. And that's why a lot of times, you know, people may hear it, may doubt it, but at least I'm having some of these conversations and those doors are opening. And I'm here right now to be able to share that. Yes. So I haven't, just as Dr. Martinez pointed out, I'm in this because it's important. And whether or not I'm skeptical, I think we have enough evidence, historical evidence, to be a little bit, question a little bit. And I think that's okay. I think being able to address that is important.
Mm-hmm. Chief Burbank?
Well, it's important because if you don't stand up and say, no, this is wrong and we're going to change behavior. I actually had a United States House of Representatives individual tell me one time when I was speaking on immigration in front of you doing here.
Oh my gosh.
And,
oh my gosh. Oh my
well, that's the reason I'm here. And that's the thing. The attitude is the same thing with crime. When we go like this and say, okay, it's not happening to me, it may be happening over here, but not affecting me, so I'm not going to get involved, I'm not going to say anything, well, then crime thrives, right? Because people know they can get away with it. The same thing happens with bias laws, bias policies, whatever you want to call it. When we don't stand up and say, hey, there's a problem with this, right? Well, then it's allowed to flourish and continue to go. And so it takes each one. It's a daunting task, and I tell my officers this all the time, right? A daunting task for one person to think they're going to change the world. But that one police officer can change that person's life that they're interacting with at that very moment. No question about it. And I think each one of us has that capacity within us. And then you start getting us together, well, you can accomplish quite a bit.
Okay, one patient that could help. Dr. Martinez?
Of course.
Okay, what?
Well, I think that they should be allowing Chief Burbank, but all the chiefs of police across the state, including, and by the way, there's sheriff's offices. That, I guess what I'm saying is what about immigration legislation? What about there as well? What about legislation with regard to the school to prison pipeline? There's so many elements of legislation, but guess what? That's not what's up on the Hill. What's up on the Hill are people who want to say, let's do more harm than good, no offense. There are people up on the Hill that don't know anything about this, don't want to know anything about this, and tell you that you're completely wrong when you talk about it. That's not all of them, but that's a lot of them. And I'm saying this up front. I guess we're kind of speaking truth to power today. The reality is I'm hoping that this will change in the next generations as young legislators come up, and hopefully they're people who have been educated in these kinds of issues, not just at the university, but before, so that they understand. I mean, I honestly have tremendous amount of humility to be on a panel with wonderful people who do this kind of work and do it all the time. So it's you know, right now I'm not going to see that kind of legislation, maybe the kind of legislation I want to see. I know that Chief Burbank's up on the Hill all the time fighting with the legislators to no, I don't want to turn my officers into immigration, you know, enforcement, you know. So I think that we all have to, by the way, you all out there, all of us could be calling legislators and saying, please introduce this kind of a bill. What about the school to prison pipeline? Yes, you're going to run into walls, but maybe you'll find a legislator who's willing to at least bring it up, and then slowly but surely. It's hard to bring these things up in the legislature, but they can be done. And some of you might become lobbyists, and that would be a great thing as well.
Other questions? Yeah, let's go in the back and then here.
Carl Spitzmacher from Salt Lake City. I'd like to understand or know, how is the news media, one of the most powerful institutions of this country, addressing it to the fact of a better directive?
I teach about media, and I'm sure all of us can speak to it.
Dr. Martinez.
Sadly, I don't think the news media is really giving us much to go on, because I don't think that our news media is really trying to, I mean, it used to be that the news media would really show us what was going on, the Vietnam War or Watergate. Now it feels like everything is under the rug or hidden. I mean, I have to hear about it from some friend that, you know, Chris is in Huffington Post, or, you know, there are some news agencies where I'm like, they're really giving you a bunch of fluff. They're really not telling you anything about the realities.
The Salt Lake Tribune and KCPW accepted. Just going to put it out there.
No, they're wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, excluding wonderful people here. By the way, PBS affiliates and NPR affiliates, my heart goes out to them. Democracy Now! You know, there are places to go. But a lot of our media is just corporately structured, and it's nothing. It's useless. When Jon Stewart becomes news, that should tell you something about the news. In my classes, we learn how significant media is to how we perceive the world. Unfortunately, the way media itself profiles. And media itself, right, if it bleeds, it leads. It will show you the worst kind of racism. I'm sorry, it will help exploit racist attitudes in the public if it's going to sell newspapers. So I don't have a lot of trust right now in media. I'm hoping that that's going to change as well. That's an institution that could really use some change in terms of how it portrays race.
We only have a few minutes left, so I want to get to some questions here, and then Professor Munoz.
Well, thanks for being here today. I don't think we can have this discussion without talking about drug policy. I'd love to hear, Chief Burbank, but the entire panel, about to what role you think that has played and how we can change that.
Much like, when you talk about drug laws, much of what we do, especially for possession and lower level sort of things, incarceration has never solved that problem, right? The issue you have is you have a very high demand within society for narcotics. And incarcerating somebody has never answered the need for, I got to have drugs.
Right.
And so there will always be somebody to fill that need. And so the mistake that I think we've made is this, no, we don't have a war against anybody in our society, right? What we're trying to do is to help them be reliant upon illegal substances, right, heavy narcotics, then the demand or the supply end will go down, and some of the violence and everything else. But because we have such a high demand, because we continue to incarcerate, that we just continue to make the problem worse, right? There is not, and the state's about 67% roughly. And when you get somebody into drug court, right, as opposed to just saying go to jail for so long and then you get out, analysis and these other things, right, recidivism in those cases drops to about 45, 46%. That's a significant reduction that we're seeing success. So why is more funding not going towards that? And that goes back to the other question, right? What do you do? The sexy part, the most important part of legislation is not the sexy part, the new laws and everything else. It's the budget.
It's the budget.
Right? And you can impact that budget and change how we do these programs, the support programs, as opposed to incarceration programs, by impacting the budget. But that's not the thing that's important, right? But really it is the most important thing that we want to impact is that budget change. And that's how you make significant changes there.
Dr. Munoz.
Once again, thanks for your coming out and visiting with us. I would like to hear your thoughts on what communities can do in order to we've been talking about legislation, things like that, different types of changing laws. What can communities do that have even lesser budgets than state offices and things like that?
We've only got a couple of minutes left. Debbie Rocha, do you have some thoughts to start?
Well, again, it's parent involvement in the schools for their, with the kids. But again, a lot of parents are working, and that's their way of being able to provide for their families. But I think again, as this, as leaders in the community and counselors in the schools, we need to be going out to the community and finding out what their needs are to help support them, so that way we can make sure that things are.
Dr. Valles?
I think there are some efforts from agencies like the ACLU on going into community to sort of provide resources and information on some of these topics, specifically with regard to racial profiling and the school-to-prison pipeline that I'm aware of. But there's a whole lot of efforts that are going out. And I think the first step right now is to provide information and awareness and to begin to offer resources to communities for mobilization. But from what I understand, there is a lot of interest because folks don't know, for instance, with my work, what they can do if a student is expelled or if they're suspended. So the first step, I think, is to just provide information. But I definitely think that's where the actual change can come from. It needs to be more grassroots oriented.
Chief Burbank.
Well, it's going to be oversimplified because of the time, and that's participation. When you look and you think about an immigration march that brought out 30,000 people several years ago, it's politics. You can influence who gets put into office, the decisions that they're going to make, the changes that they make to the budget and everything else if you participate. Without that participation in the process, then we lose sight of that.
Dr. Martinez?
That's it. You're part of this community. Get involved. Get involved. I tell my students to pick the thing that's your heart, you know, with your heart. Maybe it's undocumented immigrants. Maybe it's LGBTQ issues in their communities. What about other kinds of community? What about other kinds of families? What if it's men and men married want to work on in the community? Get involved in that, and believe me, there's a need for you.
And Dr. Brenda Valles and Debbie Rocha, thank you all very much for the time.
Thank you. But if people want to ask questions, they can. We're off the air now, I think.
Yes, we're off the air.
We are now off the air.